Hello, you're watching the Wild Monday Collective webinar series. For people tackling the impact of stress on performance at a team or organisational level, this series is a practical, honest, human approach to some of the biggest issues facing our workplaces. Today, Dr. Rachel Morris and I are talking about a sane and validated approach to tackling stress in the workplace. Managing stress and performance is one of the fastest growing areas of our thinking at work and in life in general, and so much has been written about how we can reduce stress in our lives and tackle it in our organisation. But what is scientifically validated and worth spending our organisational time and resources on, and also doable in the context of a real organisation with constraints and pressures and priorities. So firstly, Rachel, hello.
Hi, Carrie. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And tell us, first of all, about what is the background of stress? What do we need to understand about what's happening in our world to help us be able to take this sane and scientifically validated approach to tackling it?
Well, I think first of all, we need to have a bit of a deep dive into the neuroscience around stress and actually what happens to our brains when we're under chronic stress. And I like to start, when I'm talking to people about it, I always start with this curve. So you may have seen it before. It's a stress performance curve, and it just shows us how stress affects our performance. So I'll show it to you, and then I'll talk about why this happens. We all know that human beings need a little bit of stress to perform, but very soon they reach their peak performance, and if you keep putting pressure on them, their performance will start to dip down and they may even become ill. So companies that have noticed that this is a real problem, that people are working harder and harder, yet productivity is down. So the big question for me is actually, why does this happen? Well, under increased stress, we have this circulating hormone called cortisol. And cortisol does a few things to your brain which isn't very helpful. And the first thing it does, it shrinks our prefrontal cortex. Now that's this bit here. And the prefrontal cortex is the bit of our brain that makes decisions. And it lays down memories, it retrieves memories, and it's also responsible for impulse control. And when cortisol affects your prefrontal cortex, you find it very difficult to make decisions. You find it difficult to retrieve memories. But added to that, I think when we've got a lot on, when we're very, very stressed, we sort of overload our brains. Now, human beings, despite what we think, are really, really bad at multitasking. Okay, we can really only focus on one thing at a time. It's a bit like having your phone open, because actually computers can only really focus on one thing at a time too. And when you've got your phone on and you've got all your apps open, the phone slows down and it stops, doesn't it? It doesn't keep working. Our prefrontal cortexes are just like that. They're like the RAM of a computer. You can't overload it, otherwise it will slow down and stop working. So actually, part of the problem with stress is when you just got too much on, you've got too much RAM going on in your brain, too many programs open, and you start forgetting things. I don't know if you've found yourself just forgetting things and thinking, have I got Alzheimer's or something like that? And actually, it's just stress.
Yeah, it's incredible the impact that overload can have. And I find the line between not quite overloaded and overloaded quite fine and often difficult to distinguish. And it's only after I've gone some way beyond it that I realise, right, that's why I was struggling so much to do this. Remember X, respond in the way I normally would.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been, I know times when I've been under a lot of stress and I thought, well, you know what? I think I'm fine. And then I'll do something and I'll realise I've just completely forgotten to put the oven on or something like that, do something really, really stupid. But that's what's happening. So cortisol shrinks your prefrontal cortex. The other thing it does, it interferes with your hippocampus. That's the part in the midbrain, and that is responsible for emotional regulation. It's quite a helpful bit of our brain. So when we are under stress, under chronic stress, we find it quite difficult to regulate our emotions. We might find ourselves very, very angry or very tearful or ridiculously happy for no reason. So we're going up and down all over the place. And then the other thing that cortisol does, and I think this is really, really key to understanding stress and our responses to stress, is it increases the size of our amygdalas. Now, a lot of people have heard of the amygdala because it is quite a sort of trendy region of the brain. We've been talking about it a lot. The amygdala is your threat detection response system, and it kept us safe when we were living in caves. So when we were living in caves, we needed to stay safe. We needed to stay alive. So our amygdalas would detect if we were about to be eaten by a bear, if we were about to be challenged by the alpha male, if someone was going to challenge our authority, but it would also detect if we were not liked by the tribe. Because if the tribe threw us out, it would mean almost certain death. We would die of exposure. So people's approval, people liking us and not upsetting people is a hardwired threat for us, just as much as a physical threat. And I think it's really important to understand that. And when the amygdala detects this threat and is activated, we go into our fight, flight or freeze zone. And what happens when we're in fight or flight or freeze zone? We can't really do anything. Our body shuts down, our heart rate increases to help us run if we need to. And we end up making sort of decisions that are very, very black and white. And it's very, very difficult to be creative and think outside of the box and make good decisions when we're in this threat zone.
So it sounds like we've got this whole wiring in our brain designed for humans existing in a completely different context, culture, physical environment that's not really helping us at work today.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard us described as Stone Age, as living in a world of modern technology. So we haven't adapted very well at all. And we end up having the same response to a difficult email as we would do being just about to be eaten by a lion. So we've got this thing being heightened and heightened. And the amygdala is something that we can, work on our response. And actually mindfulness is something that can help sort of down-regulate it. And I have a friend who's a mindfulness teacher. And she says to me, Rachel, you just got to learn to be more gazelle. So what do you mean, be more gazelle? What are you talking about? Well, actually, when a gazelle is eating grass and a lion comes along, what does it do?
It runs away really, really fast.
Yeah, okay, this is not a trick question. And then when the lion goes away, what does it do?
Well, it just kind of, I suppose it just regroups, has a little shake, and then goes back to eating grass again.
Absolutely. So what it doesn't do, it doesn't go to all its mates and go, oh, did you see that lion? Did you see how big it was? Did you see its mane? And oh my goodness, what if it comes back later? And what happens if it comes back overnight? And you know what? I'm not going to sleep at all tonight because I'm going to be so worried about that lion. And I've got this really big presentation tomorrow and that's going to go really badly. Dun, dun, dun. So we're constantly pre-living and reliving stuff. So our amygdalas under stress keep us in this zone, even when there's nothing stressful happening. And I think, being in this zone and being in the stress zone does lead to really bad decisions. I remember once at work, I was on call, it was 5 to 6, and I got a phone call from my childminder saying, please can you come and pick up your daughter? She's one of the other children's got to go to hospital. I need to go, it's an emergency. And of course our phones at the surgery at that point went over at 6 o'clock. So I thought, okay, I was getting all my stuff ready to go. And what happened was an urgent visit was phoned in. And the story, it was a daughter who'd gone off to work, left her mother at home. Her mother hadn't been very well. And they were asking for a visit because the daughter had come home from work, found her mum really unwell. And I got on the phone and I was saying, well, what do you mean calling at this time? And what am I, this is far too late to be calling. And how dare you go to work when you knew your mother was sick? And I was awful. I really wasn't the doctor that I wanted to be at that point. And luckily, I realised what was happening and I apologised to the patient. I went out and saw them immediately and I admitted the lady to hospital, and the story has a happy ending. But I know that we can all think of times when we have not responded in the way we wanted to respond, or just not in a logical way because of the stress we were under. So I think, managing our amygdala is really important for, it's not just a nice thing to have, but it's good, it's important for things like patient safety, good clinical care, good decisions when you're managing your team, being able to keep a clear head under when there's a conflict, etc., etc.
And I can imagine people in organisations would feel like, well, I can't help the things that the organisation is putting on me, the pressures I'm under. I can't change any of these big stressors, and it's the organisation's fault. So, how can we tackle that in practice?
So I think that's a really good point, and I think this comes to the heart of resilience, is that they have a point. Sometimes there are things that they can't change, and I think what we need to do is focus on what we can change. And often there's lots of things that we can take control of that we haven't taken control over. And
So,
so any system of tackling resilience and stress in organisations has to focus on, yes, preventing those things that are causing stress within an organisation, but also empowering people to make their own decisions and their own good choices.
so just because there is a potentially stressful event, it doesn't mean that we need to be upset and stressed by it.
No, that's a really good point, because what happens is that stressful things happen, or I'd like to call them just things happen. So, you know, if you said to me, Rachel, can you prepare a presentation for 11:30? If you said now it's really important, I would be really stressed because I'm doing this webinar. I can't do it. So in my mind, that is a stressful thing. And then how I respond to that depends on whether I become stressed or not. So things happen in organisation, things change. We get business priorities change, the market change, people change, all sorts of things that we can't necessarily control. But whether we become stressed or not depends entirely on our reaction.
And I guess that's clear from, just if we think about it logically, that something that might stress me out might not stress you out, and vice versa. So the same thing has a different effect on different people. So there must be some choice about how we respond.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the key things to managing stress, is to teach people how they can respond better, because you can look at it in three different ways. You can look at the symptoms. I think that's a little bit late, but actually looking at how you change your response, and how you can actually take control of your thinking and manage yourself in a way that you would like to act, rather than your brain making the decisions about how you want to respond in the heat of the moment when your amygdala has hijacked you, is really important. And then of course the other strategy is to prevent the stuff that happens in the first place.
So given that we clearly have some kind of choice about how we respond, and yet if I think about those situations when an email comes through, if we take that as an example, and it's very easy to have quite an immediate and physical reaction to that. Sometimes I feel like I get a kind of wash of something over my body, which I guess is some kind of neurochemical firing up. It's a very physical response. How would you go about changing what feels like an unconscious, knee-jerk, automatic response?
So there are things you can do, but I think the key is what you've said, is that it's an unconscious and automatic response. And when we have that response, I describe it as being backed into a corner. We feel cornered. We're in that fight or flight zone. And you're right, it's completely automatic. We actually have no control over that. Because when something happens, we like to think that you have a trigger.
Yeah.
Think about what's happened, and then we have our reaction.
Yeah.
Quite logical, isn't it?
Yeah, and when something triggers us, we have no choice. The trigger equals the reaction, right?
Yeah. We go straight to the reaction, and the reason is we are Stone Agers living in a high-tech world. Our amygdala responds, which amygdala is part of our limbic system. It's a very ancient emotional system that keeps us safe, and it responds 5 times faster than our logical brain. So we'd have this reaction before we've even had time to think about it. And I think the mistake we make is thinking to ourselves, I mustn't react like that. You know, I mustn't have this reaction, and really try and suppress it and think to yourself, I'm such a bad person. You know, when that wave of anxiety comes over you, like you were saying, thinking it's my fault, I'm a weak person, or something like that. Absolutely not. It's your body doing, it's your brain doing what it's supposed to do to keep you safe. But what we need to do is then, once we've noticed that we're having this reaction, is to be able to change that reaction. And Dr. Steve Peters calls this reaction that we get your inner chimp. He says, your chimp will come out, and whatever. And what he says in his book, which is called The Chimp Paradox, and I would really recommend that to anybody. Dr. Steve Peters is a psychiatrist. He's also a sports psychologist. And he says that actually we can't stop the chimp from coming out, but we are responsible for managing it when it comes out. So key to it, I think, is firstly recognizing when that happens. So recognizing when you're getting those physical symptoms, or when you're starting to behave in a way. So recognize when you've been triggered, when you're in the corner, when you're in that fight or flight zone. And you can start to think about the sorts of things that put you in that zone. So for me, it's people being really rude to me. Often if I've got a lot of work on and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to manage it, that can put me in the zone. I mean, what sort of things do you recognise trigger you into the corner?
Yeah, but probably those two things actually. When I feel like people are being inconsiderate,
Mm-hmm.
or unnecessarily hostile or combative, I hate that. And even if I think the thing they're drawing to my attention to is important, and that goes in the car and on my bike, and often in those sorts of places, and also a high workload with a short time frame. At that point, I think I flip into the mode where I feel like I have this deadline or these deadlines, I have too much work to do. Anyone else who tries to get me to do anything, even have a chat over a cup of tea or just say a few words as I arrive at the office, is kind of stealing that time, which, and I know that's hugely irrational, but that's what it can feel like.
Yeah. And I think the key is that it's irrational, but actually for you it's rational because of what's going on in your head. It's the story that you're telling yourself. And I think, once you've recognized you've been triggered, you need to give yourself some space because, it takes a little bit of time to manage your chimp. But actually interrogating reality and saying, what story am I telling myself? Are my assumptions true or not? Is a really, really key thing to do. So I was coaching a team once, and one of the managers said, oh, my boss really undermined me the other day. And I said, okay, tell me what story's going on in your head. She said, well, this is what happened. I was away and we've got this project coming up and it's a really big project. And she sent an email to all my team behind my back and really undermined me because she wanted to know something. She should have come to me and talked to me about it. So we sort of used this shape and we said, well, what's the reality here? What was the story in her head? And she said, well, I think probably her boss had a word with her and just wanted to know if everything was on track, and probably she couldn't get hold of me and just didn't want to bother me because she knew I was at a conference. So she thought she said, you know what? I don't think she was trying to undermine me at all. That makes so much of a difference. Once she'd sort of gone through that, what could be occurring, actually what the alternative explanations, she was then able to go, you know what, all I need to do is just have a chat with her and say, next time, just copy me in, it's absolutely fine, and she managed to get out of the corner and then use her human rational thinking brain to choose how she responded. Because what we're trying to do is flip from using our amygdalas and our limbic system into using our prefrontal cortex, which is a decision processing bit, and our other cortices, and that's where we've built up memories about how rational human beings respond or how we responded last time and it worked, etc., and are sort of processing to decide how I want to respond. For me, asking myself, how do I want to respond? Because often when I'm in the corner, I just want to tell them what I think and, be really grumpy and make their lives really miserable. But actually think to myself, in 2 days' time, when I look back on this, how would I like to have responded to this? Or, when my children look back on this reaction I just had, how do I want them to have experienced me? That's quite a key one for me. So recognizing when you've been triggered, so recognizing almost the physicality of what happens when you've been triggered and what you start to think, giving yourself space. I mean, often I say, if you can, go for a walk around the block, or, try and give yourself time and get back to someone. I mean, have you find there's any ways that you give yourself space when you feel that you're backed in the corner?
I think I've got better at recognizing any feeling as just a feeling, and better at stopping in the moment and asking myself, what's really going on here. So I think I now see any emotional reaction as probably it's sourced somewhere different from the thing I think it's sourced from. So that becomes more of a reflex. I think as I started to use this tool in the early days, I would write things down. So I'd write down the things I was thinking in my head, and then I'd write my questions, and then I'd write down what I thought the reality was. And I found that was the way to slow my brain down enough to think about it. And I can't do that every 5 minutes at work, but where a work relationship or a home relationship really matters, putting aside 5 or 10 minutes to do that is hugely worthwhile.
Yeah, that's a brilliant example of something that can really help. And those are sort of time-honoured CBT techniques, you know, of actually, you know, interrogating your thinking, thinking what's going on. I mean, I guess in the moment when these things happen, it's just having that awareness that you're in the corner is really powerful for people. And I have known teams actually either buy themselves little chimps and put them on their computers to show each other that their chimp is out, or use the box there and sort of stick it there so people sort of know, and then they can come and help them get out. I think it is about training your brain, and it's about practice. And the good thing about our brains is there's this thing called neuroplasticity, that the more you practice thinking in certain different ways, the more you get used to it and the easier it becomes, and it becomes much more second nature. So, you know, all these things don't come straight away, but it's good to have the awareness of what's going on. And I found that this type of thing, talking to people about how we react and then giving people tools, was one of the really key things that helped change teams and the way they work together and the stress they're experiencing from each other, as well as people sort of finding practical solutions to think, actually, if I send that email, will that trigger their chimp? Is that going to get their chimp out? And how can I do this differently? Maybe if I just picked up the phone and spoke to them, that would be a much better way of doing it. And so the corner and the box is just one of the shapes that I use in an organisation to try and help, you know, people to access some tools and things that are really going to help them. And I thought I'd just talk through a few other things that might be helpful. In the higher zone here, in the preventing zones, we've talked quite a lot about how you respond to stress. But actually, I think there's a lot of things you can do to prevent these things from being stressful in the first place. And this is also where organisations need to focus for their teams, for their managers, and actually right at the top of the organisation, so you start to talk about things throughout the whole organisation. Because actually, one of the biggest causes of stress, depression or anxiety is actually people's workload. Causes up to 44% of stress, depression and anxiety. And whenever I'm coaching people, they for resilience, they tell me that time is, they need to work on their time management. And after I've coached them for a couple of minutes, I realise it's not actually their time management they need to work on. They've got too much to do in the time available to them. They need to be able to stop and think and learn how to prioritise their time and to just cut out all the stuff that's not important. There's a lot more stuff that's not important than we think there is. So how do we do that? How do we prioritise our time? And then how are we proactive to stop, to be able to stop all these urgent things from taking over our time all the time?
It sounds like there are a series of these shapes, one of which we've seen, which is the corner, and other tools that people can quickly connect with and which resonate, that allow people to access stuff that's scientifically validated and which is easy to use in the real world. And is there one for prioritising?
There is something it's a prioritisation grid, and actually lots of people will have used this before. They may have encountered it as the Eisenhower urgent important matrix, and it's a really simple way of just doing a brain dump in terms of what you need to, your tasks for the day, and then looking at what categories they fall into. And most people find that actually most of their day seems to be dealing with the urgent and important stuff, and it just takes over everything else, and they don't have any time to spend looking at the really important stuff, but stuff that no one's actually shouting for. So that might be managing your teams, it might be having one-to-ones, it might be thinking about your strategy or your goals, or thinking about your well-being. So I'm going to be covering this in another webinar in much more detail, but it's just to mention it's really helpful to give both individuals and managers tools so that people can work through this themselves, but also managers can sit down and have a coaching conversation with their teams to say, how are we going to prioritise, you know, and how are you going to plan to do those things that are really important but not necessarily urgent, and actually what can you do to either delegate or get rid of that stuff that's just not important.
Wonderful. And what other tools are there that you find people find particularly helpful and use over and over again?
I think one tool that we use a lot is the vortex of busyness. And I think, I don't know about you, Carrie, but when the work gets more and more and more, the first thing I do is give up those things that re-energize me. I just work harder and harder and harder. And I was developing a course a couple of years ago, and I had to write a handbook, and there was a very short space of time to write the handbook. And I ended up putting my kids in childcare, stopping going to the gym, and then waking up and thinking about the stuff all the time. And I found that I was going down the vortex of busyness. And I mentioned this, I think, in the webinar we had on Monday about well-being and how you can get some interventions that actually work. Because I think, you know, unfortunately, professionals in jobs where it demands a lot of their time, where you might be perfectionist, where you get a lot of your identity by what you do at work, we're particularly prone to this, the vortex of business. And at the bottom is burnout. And you do not want to be in a place where you've burnt out, because it takes quite a long time to recover from burnout.
And so how could somebody use this in practice? What could an individual or a team do to turn this around?
Well, the key thing is being able to reverse the cycle and spiral back at the vortex of business, and to put in some key things that are going to stop you going down there. I mean, one of the things I would say to people is, when the work gets harder and harder, what's the first thing that you stop doing? And most people say, well, I stop seeing my friends, or I stop doing my exercise. And then I say to them, well, how important is that to you? And most people go, you know what, that's almost vitally important to my health and well-being. Yet it's the first thing that you stop doing. So actually, often it's not that people don't know what to do. It's they need help. They need help in doing it. And the government, a few years ago, quite helpfully had a look at the mental health of the population and realised that actually most of us, 23% are languishing or had a mental health problem. And only 17% of the population were flourishing. And they looked at all the studies to do with well-being and to do with physical good health, and tried to work out a 5 a day for your mind, a bit like 5 fruits and veg a day, because they realised that if you could just shift that curve just by 5%, you'd get a much higher proportion in the flourishing zone. And again, if you look at the science behind well-being, you'll be able to sort of understand how they came up with these things, this sort of 5 fruits and veg a day for the mind, which they call the ways to well-being. And Martin Seligman, who is the father of positive psychology, has done a really good TED talk about this. And he, through doing lots of experiments, has realised there are 3 types of life. Now, positive psychology came about in the late 80s, 1990s, when they realised that psychologists are spending a lot of time looking at what made people who maybe be depressed be able to function normally, rather than making people who didn't have a mental health problem be able to feel better and more positive in their life. So they did lots of experiments, lots of studies, and found that there were 3 types of life. The first one is the pleasant life. So this is a life where you can buy nice experiences and you can do nice things. And it gives me an excuse to show my holiday snaps. So this is me skiing.
Lovely.
Nice experience, lovely. It was wonderful. And so having good experience can buy you a certain level of satisfaction, but only a certain level. And actually then having more good experiences doesn't really increase your satisfaction very much. The second type of life is the good life, where you are regularly doing something that gets you into this thing called flow. Have you heard of flow?
Yes.
Flow before?
Yes, tell us more about flow.
So flow is this thing where you are completely engrossed in what you're doing, where time stands still, where you can't you can't concentrate on anything else because you've got the appropriate level of challenge. You're really enjoying yourself. And this is really good for our souls and for our brains. And if you can regularly engage in activities that get you into flow, then you will be experiencing a lot of satisfaction in life. And the sort of activities that get you into flow are so maybe playing a team sport or learning a new skill. And some of us can achieve that in our work. And I think it's really important that we find those things in our work that we really love to do, that get us into this process of flow. So I get into flow when I'm teaching or training or coaching. Not so much when I'm doing my admin. So that's the first two types of life. You've got your pleasant life, you've got your life that doing something gets you into flow, so often playing a musical instrument or something like that gets you into that. But then the third type of life, and this is the one that causes the most satisfaction, is a life where you are giving beyond yourself, where you've got some purpose. And this is me on a charity bike ride. So I'm being active and I'm managing to give a little bit. So purpose and giving beyond yourself has been shown to be really good for our mental well-being and our satisfaction levels. So if you put all this together, you get the ways to well-being. And the top 5, connect, give, learn and play, notice and be active, these are the ones that the government have come up with. And these are all over NHS Choices and the Mind website, all about how you can, feel better. I've put the bottom 3 in as well, because I think there's emerging research about the importance of sleep and getting good sleep, both in learning and problem solving and decision making, and also the ability to eat well. And I think none of this is possible without setting boundaries, without being able to say, actually, when am I going to do it? How long am I spending in the office? When am I going to turn off my email? All those sorts of things. So well-being is really, really important. But I think the trouble with well-being is that very often the interventions we have in our organisations are superficial and a bit ineffective. Because, actually, if you look at this list, connecting with other people, being able to give to others, noticing is all about being mindful, living in the present moment, being active. Well, we know about this. We know what to do, don't we? But it's actually changing our behaviour.
Yeah.
Really, really important. And so giving people tools to use to change your behaviour, to give people accountability, to be able to set goals, to be able to plan what they're going to do, to be able to deal with their setbacks is really, really important. And actually giving people the ability to make the time to make the changes too is often quite a big thing. So one thing we can do is help people have the conversations around well-being, where actually we use this sheet to get people, they get to rate themselves, and then have a conversation on those dials that they seem to be in the red zone. Actually, how could they push their dial up a little bit and get into the amber or the green zone? And I think some education combined with having conversations with other people and some accountability is really, really key to increasing well-being, both personally but also in teams and organisations.
This feels like something you could use on your own. So I'm kind of mentally scoring myself as we're talking, and also as part of a coaching conversation, but also as a team activity. So if I can imagine a team running an offsite or just their normal kind of monthly half-day session, and being able to devote 20 minutes to having a look at some of these, rating themselves, and then talking to each other about their ratings and what they might want to do about it. It's very, very practical and easy to use.
It's practical and it's fun. It's a great, you can have a great interaction and great times thinking about how you can set more boundaries or get more sleep, and what you can do as a team to connect more. Because there's so much evidence about, firstly, connection and having a couple of good friends that you can connect with regularly who listen to you. That's called pro-social bonding. But also the evidence is that having friends at work is massively important for your mental health and for your well-being. And a lot of people say, oh, I don't need to have friends at work. But someone said to me the other day, and I don't know this is a true fact, but it was a very credible source, that having a good friend at work can increase your life expectancy by 7 years.
Gosh.
Amazing. And there's been all sorts of evidence from, there's a really interesting study in the Harvard Business Review, and they looked at a call centre and the different interactions that they were having in a call centre. They didn't measure what was in the interactions, but just how they were done. So they had little microchips on them, which measured whether they interacted by email or talking or whatever. And they found that the team that performed the best had the most informal interactions. And so, interesting for a call centre, what they then did was make everyone take a coffee break at the same time, and then productivity went through the roof. So having a time where you can talk with your team about how you're connecting at work and how you can improve the quality of those connections is really good, not only for your mental health, but also for productivity in the organisation as well.
And it sounds like some of these things are slightly counterintuitive, and things that take a bit of a brave leap to say, in order to be more productive, we're actually going to eliminate some of the time on the phones, for example. That's a big, bold step for anybody to take in a numbers driven business like a call centre.
Absolutely, but the evidence is there. And if you look at, you know, just even the productivity evidence, once you've been working for 10 hours, you're done. You're not going to be any more productive. And there's so much evidence about being active, for example, even just walking for half an hour at lunchtime will massively increase your productivity in the afternoon. So you're daft if you don't take lunch break, for example, because you will slow down and you won't stop properly. So resting, taking breaks, being active, all these things actually will drive up the bottom line for your company rather than reduce it. But I think the mistake companies make is thinking that this is a purely individual thing.
Yeah.
Quite often managers need to be involved in helping people with their, you know, with their well-being. And often managers say to me, oh, it's none of my business. I can't even begin to have these conversations.
Yeah.
But actually, it's the manager that often dictates the working patterns of people and when they can start and stop. And actually, if maybe someone needs to have time to go for a run in the morning, they can do that and work later. What can the manager do to enable people to maximise their well-being? Actually, by using something like this, that makes it a really non-threatening conversation, rather than sitting there going, right, let's talk about your well-being, how well are you, type thing.
And we talked about things that help individuals take responsibility more for their own well-being and starting to proactively manage their workflow. What's the relationship between building up resilient people and trying to change the workplace in which they're operating? Which matters more?
I think you need both, Carrie, because I think if you put someone who's incredibly resilient into a bad workplace, they will work harder and harder and harder, and eventually they'll start to pop off the top of that curve, and eventually they'll leave, or they'll, even worse, they'll burn out or go off sick. Interesting. I had a patient that came in and she said, you know, doctor, I need to be signed off sick from work. I said, well, why? And she said, I don't like the person I sit next to. I thought, well, that's ridiculous. I'm not signing you off for that. And then I thought to myself, well, okay, what's going on? And I spoke to her and she's sat next to this horrible person, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and her managers weren't doing anything about it. And I thought to myself, actually, that was a very stressful thing to be coping with day after day after day. And I think we sometimes think that a lack of well-being and a lack of resilience is the reason we go off sick. And actually, all the evidence is that a toxic workplace and excessive workload and all those sorts of things are actually the causes of a lot of our sickness and our depression and our anxiety. And not only that, they cause physical problems as well. Because I mentioned in the last webinar, the main things that predict if you're off sick with back pain, whether you're going to come back to work quickly or whether you're going to take a long time to come back to work, is bad leadership, control over decisions. And so I think organisations that just focus on helping people be well are really missing a trick, because if you put well people in a bad workplace, they will still burn out or leave, and you're not going to be producing very much effort, very much results at all.
So then if an organisation is going to try and tackle the workplace, that's a big area, and really, other than the CEO, no one person has sole control or has the ability to control all of those things. So where do you start if you're trying to tackle the organisation itself?
I think there are some quick wins that you can have in an organisation, and these have been adapted from the Health and Safety Executive's sort of 6 causes of workplace stress. And I think any manager or any team would do really well to just have a look at what's going on in each of these 8 areas. And if you look at them in more detail, there are some things that you could have some pretty quick wins about. You know, i.e. making sure you're regularly having one-to-ones. It only need to be 5 minutes sometimes, but, you know, leaving big, you know, month-long gaps between when you see your teams often causes a lot of stress. You know, just looking at career, sometimes people's stress is due to the fact they can't see a pathway for promotion, and they don't really know what they need to do to get ahead in their job. So being able to have those conversations and saying, well, if you do this, this and this, then we'll be able to do this and that, is massive stress reliever. And then just doing some things that are going to build up relationships, build up trust. So I think, yes, the organisation right from the top need to look at their processes and the things that are causing stress. But actually, there's an awful lot that managers can do within their own team, and also the teams can do for themselves. I think sometimes teams get a bit disempowered and think someone else has got to change everything for me. I can't possibly do that myself.
So how would, what can an organisation do to, can you give any practical examples of an organisation you know that has tackled some of these successfully? So give us a flavour for what that might look like.
Well, one organisation I was working, we did a bit of an audit. So we did some sessions where we got people together to talk about in each of these areas what was really going on. And so we collected all sorts of stories of what was happening and the things that were causing the main stress for people in the organisation. And so they built up a really good picture of the things that they could do something about quickly, the things that they actually needed to take a deeper look at, and the things that were, you know, causing people stress. So actually speaking to their people and then sort of devising a series of interventions that actually help. So a series of maybe workshops that go through some of the shapes and help people be more proactive about stuff, but also working out how an organisation can make this sustainable, can support each other, how you can train people to have really good conversations with each other about all of this. So you're not reliant on external facilitators coming in all the time, or you're not relying on the boss sorting it out, but people start to do this for themselves and have really good sort of peer-to-peer coaching, listening, partnerships and conversations.
So it sounds like many of these things are relatively easy to start doing straight away, like having more frequent one-to-one conversations and improving the quality of those conversations, for example. Some of these are simple things, and I can see how an organisation might feel quite daunted that this sort of to be branded a toxic workplace is it feels completely overwhelming as something to have the ability to change, given the market conditions outside the business and given the sort of, you know, often feel like we're stuck in a load of systems and technology and processes that dictates our workload. But actually some of these measures are pretty straightforward and more part of the sort of soft infrastructure of the business that any manager can tackle quite quickly.
Yeah, I think the key to it is getting people to change their mindset, actually. And this is where the drama triangle comes in. And again, I talked through this on the previous webinar. I'll just talk about it very quickly. The drama triangle is developed by Dr. Stephen Cartman, and it's a psychology model that's used by psychologists sort of throughout the world. Describes this elaborate game that we get into, and I think we get into it in the workplace and at home as well, in which you take the victim mentality, you feel very helpless, you feel you can't do anything about it. And it's based on the sort of fairy tale drama. So you have a damsel in distress who's your victim, completely helpless. You have your rescuer, who is your knight in shining armor, who's a complete hero. And then you have the persecutor, that often the organization, who's the villain, who's evil and you know, is just persecuting the whole time. And talking to people about changing their mindset to get out of those roles is really, really important. And so rather than being a victim and saying everything's always happening to me and no one's helping me, you talk to people about how they can become activators, how they can actually take control, they can take their own power. And I often talk about the zone of power, and this is quite a nice way of thinking about whether I'm actually taking control of myself or not. Because I think if you imagine that, actually I'll go back to that slide there. If you imagine that whole blue slide, that's the whole of your life, okay? And then that circle in there, that's the things I can control. Well, that is my power. That taking control of the things I can control is my own power. For example, I can't control what my children ate for breakfast this morning. I can control what I ate for breakfast this morning. I can control what cereals I have in the house to some extent. So, you know, there are things I can control. Now, people that get very, very stressed tend to focus on what they can't control. And I think when you're in the victim mentality, you're feeling helpless, you'll just focus on what everyone else is doing and just say, isn't it awful and I can't do anything. But when I become an activator, I take control. I think, actually, what conversations do I need to be having? What resources do I need here? Actually, it's not entirely clear what my job is. Let me just go and have that conversation. And how can I help other people to help me? So taking control as an activator, really important. And then helping your managers, rather than be rescuers, taking the role of a coach. And so rather than taking all the work off someone to solve it for them and solving all their problems, you start to ask questions like, actually, how can I help this person solve their own problems? How can I support them in doing that? What conversations are going to be helpful? And that is helping managers how to have these basic coaching conversations. And actually, often, coaching isn't that difficult. It's quite hard to give up giving advice, but not actually coach. So teaching managers a simple coaching model and simple techniques that just get them out of the mindset of rescuing and getting them into the mindset of supporting and coaching is really, really important. And then how do we get the organisation out of the persecutor role? Well, we get them to think of themselves as a catalyst, as people that are providing challenges to their teams. But because you're thinking of your teams as people who are activators, not victims, you're saying to people, look, here's the challenge. How do you reckon you can do it? How do you reckon you can do it? What resources do you need? How can we really support you? And also, actually, what is there, again, back to the causes of workplace stress, what is there that we're doing that's really causing problems, and how can we remove that? So it's about a mindset shift really for the whole organisation, to get people empowered, get people using tools that will really, really help them take responsibility and take control for themselves.
And these tools and shapes that you've shared with us today, where do they come from, and how do they fit together? And if an organisation wanted to tap into them, what could they do?
So I've put all these shapes and tools together, and I call them the Shapes Toolkit, and it's really a series of concepts that we can present either as standalone workshops or in day-long or a couple of days training. And we can also train up people within the organisation to act as Shapes ambassadors. So rather than just, one-off training, we disappear, actually we can help people cement it into an organisation. So you start to talk about these things that you can do, and also giving people, blank worksheets, blank canvases to use in their one-to-one conversations with their teams, helps them all just start to think in this activator role constantly. So if people are interested in trying to use some of these tools in their organisation, I'd be really, really happy to have a conversation with them, or just even to think aloud about some of the causes of stress and what they can do about it. I'm also making these tools accessible for people. If you join my World Monday Collective, which is my mailing list, I'd love to share some of the resources with you for free, and you could sort of take those away and have a think about how that might go for your organisation. And if you'd like me to come and do a free lunch and learn talk about the shapes, about how you can start to implement this for your people in your organisation, then do contact me, and I'd love to be able to have a conversation with you.
Rachel, thank you so much. You've been listening to the Wild Monday Collective webinar series. There are other webinars in this series, and our next webinar is coming up in 2 weeks' time, and you can find out more about that on the website. Find out more about Wild Monday at www.wildmonday.co.uk, and you can join Rachel on Twitter at Dr. Rachel Morris, and you can also follow at wild_Monday. And if you wanted to take Rachel up on her offer of a conversation about a situation in your organisation or your team, you can do so and book a call straight into her diary using the Calendly link in the show notes. All the links and references to websites or resources that Rachel's mentioned today will also be in the show notes. And we look forward to welcoming you at a Wild Monday Collective webinar in the future. Many thanks.
Thank you.